Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before my colleague, Dr. Laurie Peake, introduces today's speaker, Dr. Carlie Trott, we would like to acknowledge that CU Boulder sits on the territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Eastern Shoshone peoples, and 48 tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. It is critical not only to acknowledge, but also to actively address the particular harms that settler colonialism and institutions who benefit from colonialism, including CU Boulder, perpetuate on Indigenous lands and peoples, especially in the context of this Mellon Sawyer seminar, where we are seeking to attend to more capacious humanities, arts, and sciences-based alliances for long-term ecological transformation. Simultaneously, we assert that such alliances must also acknowledge the socio-cultural, artistic, linguistic, and other strategies that Indigenous communities have used and continue to use to respond to intensive ecological disruptions. We also want to thank our collaborative partners today. This program is generously funded by a Sawyer Seminar on the Comparative Study of Cultures grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Additionally, we thank our institutional partners at CU Boulder, the Nest Studio for the Arts, the Natural Hazard Center, the Center for Native American and Indigenous Studies, and the Art and Art History Department. This public lecture is one of multiple, along with several art exhibitions around the Boulder, Denver area that will be hosted this semester and were also hosted last semester. As part of the 2020-2021 Mellon Sawyer Seminar, Deep Horizons, Making Visible an Unseen Spectrum of Ecological Casualties and Prospects. We aim to traverse multiple disciplines and perspectives to investigate intersectional questions concerning the changing planet as it affects specific peoples, communities, wildlife species, and ecosystems in varying and inequitable ways. This project calls for empathy, attunement, and an outlook that encompasses a diversity of individuals, communities, and collaborative entities committed to climate justice and more ethically durable futures. Please do visit our Environmental Futures website to learn more and to register for upcoming events. Before Laurie introduces Carlie today, here are a couple Zoom protocols that we do ask you to follow. We ask that you keep your microphones muted so that no one is distracted by any background noises. And if you have a question, please type it into the chat box. Once we're finished with, Dr. Trott is finished with her presentation, we expect to have time to address those questions then. And now I will hand it over to Dr. Laurie Peake to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you so much, Bonnie, for that introduction and the welcome. And I just want to join Bonnie in welcoming all of you to today's seminar. I've been looking forward to this for many, many months, and it is a great pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Carlie Trott today. Carlie is an assistant professor of social and community psychology at the University of Cincinnati. And Carlie has many, many honors that are available via her CV and her website, and I hope that you will check those out. I know this is the time that sometimes we read long bios and introductions to person's work and so forth, but I'm going to forego that today because I feel very truly blessed that I actually had the opportunity to know Carlie and to come to know Carlie through serving as a member of her dissertation committee when we were both at Colorado State University. And Carlie's dissertation is this extraordinary work. It's 272 pages that I could not stop reading. Carlie wrote a dissertation that was simultaneously it was rigorous, it was community-based, it was grounded in children's experiences and a broader commitment to climate justice. In that dissertation, Carlie developed a curriculum called Science Camera Action. She implemented that curriculum with youth from Northern Colorado. She evaluated that curriculum to see how it affected young people's knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs, and also how it shaped their engagement and empowerment around this changing climate and this ever more turbulent world that young people are coming of age in today. Her writing is lyrical, it's beautiful, it's absolutely groundbreaking, the work that she has done. And over these last several years, we have seen what young people can do in the face of incredible climate uncertainty. And so it is such a tremendous honor to welcome Carlie to join us today. She has prepared a presentation and we'll leave a little bit of time at the end for Q&A. And so we do hope that you'll drop your questions or comments into the chat as we go, and then Carlie will attend to those at the end. And so with that, I hope you will, if you can, figure out an emoji that will allow you to give a warm virtual round of applause and welcome to Carlie. And Carlie, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori, for that wonderful introduction. I am so excited to be here and to be sharing my research with all of you today. So let me go ahead and figure out how to share my screen. We'll get started. Let's see. Okay, can you see just my first title slide now? Okay, all right, wonderful. Well, thanks again, everyone, for being here today. My presentation for you is entitled Envisioning Climate Just Futures, Youth-Led Community Action Through the Arts. So I'll just give a bit of a background on myself before getting started. I did my graduate work in applied social psychology at Colorado State University. And before that, I completed a bachelor's degree in the arts in art management in Chicago at Columbia College. So my research broadly focuses on processes of transformative social change, but more specifically, the psychology of climate justice and the approaches to sustainability, education, and action. So in my research, I like to use community partnerships and participatory methods, including youth-led participatory action research. And what I mean by that really is that I like to partner with communities to do research that is action focused, that instead of just sort of collecting data to do research about people or on people, it's about kind of finding answers to questions together in a collaborative process, and to be making action and social change a part of the research process. So I, as Lori said, I'm an assistant professor in psychology at the University of Cincinnati, and I advise students in the doctoral program there in community and organizational research for action. And I teach undergraduate and graduate students about community engaged research, as well as in social psychology. So just a quick overview of the presentation. I'm going to start out today by kind of framing the issue, and I'm going to spend some time with that. I'm going to talk about climate as more than a science issue. I'm going to talk about the climate crisis specifically in social justice terms. Then I'm going to get into my work and some examples of the work that I've done with youth using arts-based engagement methods to do community action addressing local environmental problems. And then towards the end, I'm going to look ahead at the idea of building towards climate just futures and some more recent projects that I've been working on related to youth climate justice activism and how we are dealing with climate justice in educational contexts. So I think we really went over most of this already. So I'll be talking for about 45 minutes. There'll be Q&A at the end, but I really encourage you, if you have questions at all throughout the presentation, please just go ahead and put those in the chat. I don't want you to feel like you have to keep them in your head for the whole presentation. So deposit them there, and then I will be happy to address them in that time towards the end. It looks like everybody has their microphones muted and everything. So disclaimer, This presentation is really grounded in my work, the research in this area, the work that I've done for the past, better part of a decade. But I definitely don't claim to be, the sole authority on these topics. I fully expect that people might be coming at these topics from different angles, and I would look forward to chatting with you about that later on. So let's get started. All right, so here we are in Colorado. In some ways, we're all familiar with this image, right? This is a common one. Everyone's seen something like it, but it's a profound artifact of the age that we live in. And as simple as it is, this image is amazing because it demonstrates the capacity of humans to operate in space, compile spatial imagery, provide it to one another, and to be able to have this perspective at all. So while the image is both, pretty simple and common, but simultaneously amazing, it's also missing something really important, and that is to really understand the planet Earth in the 21st century and how its ecosystems will fare in the decades to come. We have to take into account its most influential species. Okay, so this imagery is from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in 2017, and it represents sort of the best representation available of our human presence on the global landscape. So bright yellow represents low persons per square kilometer, with darker shades indicating greater population density. So this imagery is accurate down to the individual building, thanks to a combination of global national census data and high resolution imagery. Human impacts are felt in nearly every surface ecosystem on the planet, with the exception of the coldest and driest places. And finally, this imagery represents the interactions of humans with their environments. So the purple and pink hues are places that are directly impacted in some way by human activity. So the green and brown places are those that have little to no human population or interaction. And as you can see, there's really limited land mass here that's not directly impacted by human activity. And I would go as far as to say, the oceans are included in this as well, because even these places are not beyond our gaze or our reach, nor are they free from alterations due to our activity. So the era in which we now find ourselves living has come to be called the Anthropocene, the age of humans. And so among the impacts that humans are having on ecosystems around the globe, climate change is increasingly recognized among the most critical challenges facing humanity. The well-being of individuals and societies are tied to the stability of natural systems, and the effects of climate change are now visible across the globe. So the 2010s went down as the warmest decade ever recorded. Remarkably, 19 of the last 20 years on record have occurred since the year 2000. And of course, we're now feeling the impacts of climate change locally in Colorado. Some of the largest wildfires occurred just last year. And in Cincinnati, where I am, extreme flooding events are becoming much more common and widespread as well. So I think seeing such images just makes it easier to understand climate change, not just as an environmental issue, but as a profoundly social issue. And as we think about climate change as a social issue, we can see evidence of this at every level of the climate change problem. So thinking first about causes, well, climate change is primarily a matter of concentrations of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, right? The number one contributor to climate change is the burning of fossil fuels, such as coal, oil, and natural gas. And of course, this is related to how we power our lives, as well as how our societies are structured, how our economies function. And next, in terms of the consequences or impacts of climate change, well, of course, the primary impacts of climate change are taking place at the level of Earth systems. But we can see that these are profoundly social. For example, when we consider that climate the climate impacts are affecting people's physical and mental health, and threatening some of our most basic human needs, including food, water, and shelter. And then thinking about solutions, well, interdisciplinary climate change researchers tell us that there's two ways to be addressing the climate problem. And the first is around mitigation, and that has to do with reducing concentrations of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. For example, through transitioning to renewable energy sources, just such as wind and solar. And then there's climate change adaptation. And this area recognizes that even if all greenhouse gas emissions stop today, the climate will continue to change due to lags in physical processes set in motion. And so adaptation is the area that deals with minimizing harms associated with the climate change impacts listed here. And so, for example, this area deals with the development of policies and programs to build community resilience in response to disasters. And if we consider climate change solutions from a social perspective, we can see that this will require large scale social and cultural transformation, including policy change. So the fact is that everyone is at risk under a changing climate. The consequences of climate change will be universal, affecting everyone on the planet, but they will be inequitable because climate change disproportionately impacts the world's most vulnerable and marginalized groups. And so this is why we talk about climate justice. And this term has been advanced to recognize the intersections between environmental degradation related to climate change and its ethical, social, and political dimensions. So as this image here shows, those countries that have historically contributed the very least to the problem through greenhouse gas emissions in blue on the top are some of the most vulnerable or most likely to experience climate change impacts in the red on the bottom. And so now, considering climate change as an issue of social justice, not only will those who contribute the least face the largest impacts at a global scale, this is also true within countries, as was mentioned earlier. So, for example, the most socially and economically disadvantaged groups in the US are hit the hardest by climatological events. We see this when the poorest families don't have the means to evacuate during extreme weather, and so they face increased risk. And it is these most vulnerable and marginalized groups within and across countries that have the least role in decision-making and action on ways to address climate change. And so my work in this area deliberately takes into account these social and political dimensions and aims to amplify the voices and center the experiences of vulnerable and marginalized groups. So climate change as a human-driven phenomenon has attracted the interest of psychologists from a variety of disciplines. And here we see examples of how psychologists have approached the issue. And I'm not going to go over all of these topics, but to date, most psychology research actually takes place over here, looking at individual processes related to how people think and feel and act. And mostly this is in relation to the environment. So they ask, how do we bring about broad-based social change to minimize our impact on the environment? My research takes place over here and applies a structural lens to addressing the issue of climate change through, for example, people's political participation, their engagement in their communities, and so on. And so in addition to looking at pro-environmental behaviors, I also focus on collective and collaborative action within community settings and advancing the participation of marginalized groups or those who will be most affected. So just looking at these two approaches next to each other, in the language of interventions from the field of community psychology, we can consider some of the more traditional approaches here on the left to be sort of in the form of ameliorative interventions. In other words, they're promoting changes that take place within the current system in terms of people's personal attitudes and lifestyle choices. And my research in the language of interventions, getting back to sort of the broader scope of my research program, aims to be transformative. For example, by reflecting back on the need for institutional and policy level change, my research emphasizes how we can be making changes to the current systems. So I just want to quickly tell my story and how I got into the work that I do. I got into sustainability focused research as a graduate student at Colorado State University. So my second summer living there, a massive wildfire took place in the Roosevelt National Forest just outside of Fort Collins where I was living. And once it was contained, it was determined that the High Park fire was the second largest wildfire in Colorado state history in terms of area burned, and the third worst in terms of houses burned. And a week later, a week after that fire was contained, that record would be broken by another wildfire. And the following year, a great flood spread. Maybe some people who live in the area remember this. It was spread across 200 miles of the Colorado Front Range. The state had been in a long drought and then got 15 inches of rainfall in the span of a single week. And the flood killed 8 people and caused an estimated $2 billion worth of damage. And so the fire and the flood were devastating and absolutely impossible to ignore. And I knew that they were becoming more frequent and more extreme due to climate change. And so after finishing my master's, I transitioned to doing climate change research. I looked around my city to see what kinds of initiatives existed. And in my training in applied social psychology, I had learned to plug into existing efforts, to try, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, look at what's going on around you and try to plug in. And so what I discovered was that my city was a leader among cities in climate action planning. So they had emissions reduction goals at the time that were as aggressive as global cities like Melbourne and Copenhagen. And not only that, but this was at a time in 2015 when they were revising their 2009 plan and holding these local public forums. And so when I attended, I learned that their plans included transitioning to renewables, improving building efficiency and reducing waste, among other things. And this was all great stuff. But as a social psychologist, I was kind of looking at this stuff and wondering, where's the social component? So I didn't see a lot about, education or outreach or social mobilization. It was just like this image here is perfect. This kind of represents what the plan was looking like. There was a lot of technology and infrastructure changes. So I was asking myself, where are the people? And a good metaphor for this was, it was as if they were building a car or a vehicle, to drive us all into a more sustainable future. And the car was perfect. It had all the right parts, but they weren't necessarily thinking about the people that would have to get into that car and convince them that they would want to go, where that car was going. And it kind of reminded me that this is really sometimes how we think about climate change, in images such as these, like of storms and floods and fires and melting ice sheets, but less in terms of images of people. And equations. This one shows the methane combustion process, producing 2 greenhouse gases, or the flows of, different sources of greenhouse gas emissions and how they contribute, or the Keeling curve that we're also familiar with that talks about how we are so far outside of these, kind of historical averages relating to the concentrations of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. But I want to make the case that other kinds of images are as or potentially more compelling, and that these involve the arts. So images that allow us to think about life differently and show us a path forward. Images that give us a glimpse into a better future, one where the fight to address climate change was won. Or those that give us ideas about how to join or conceive of this fight today. Or ones that show us that others are doing it and we can too. So the research that I'm going to present to you today began with this idea in mind, the idea that in addition to being an issue of science and the environment, that climate change is an issue that requires cultural transformation. And my research takes this as a starting point and focuses especially on the role of children and youth in advocating and acting for their future. So let's get into some of the research here. And this research starts with the idea that children are key stakeholders in efforts to address climate change, but that they're underengaged, and first in terms of climate change education, where there's no standardized curriculum for teaching climate change in the formal classroom. And they're also underengaged in forms of sociopolitical and environmental action on the issue. But children are also overlooked in research. So while there's this huge, vast and growing literature on how adults think and feel and act, in relation to climate change, we know much less about how young people are thinking and dealing with this issue, although that's changing. But they were particularly understudied, or not very understood as potential agents of change within their families and communities. And so children face numerous barriers to their active engagement with the issue. So in terms of their awareness, not only is there no standardized curriculum to teach about climate change, in a report released by the National Center for Science Education, science teachers talked about not spending very much time on the issue in the classroom or neglecting it altogether. It's a choice, whether to cover that. And children's participation is also hindered by culturally entrenched notions of the role of children and young people in society, right? So our dominant cultural narratives tell us to consider childhood as primarily a period of preparation and socialization for the full citizenship of adulthood. And so children are often not invited to participate in decisions and actions around issues that'll impact their lives. And this, of course, is deeply related to the idea that children face political barriers. And this is around the idea that politics is an adult-only sphere. But why should we be looking at promoting children's climate change engagement? Well, there's a couple of arguments here. One is sort of the moral and ethical argument that today's children are already living under conditions of a changing climate, and they will continue to face unfolding impacts as they grow up. So as key stakeholders, it's only fair to include them in discussions and actions around the issue. And the sort of pragmatic or practical argument goes like this. Well, today's children are experiencing climate change impacts already. And in addition to being citizens of today who should be involved in the civic and political life of their communities, they'll also be tomorrow's climate change decision makers and leaders and people who are handling and experiencing the problems of the earth that they inherited. So it'll practical sense to prepare children to face the realities of the present and the future. And so knowing that climate change can be unsettling to learn about, that it's not your typical school subject, that it's qualitatively different in many ways from other topics that children might learn around in the classroom, my research in this area has been guided by questions like, how do we facilitate children's constructive climate change engagement? And how do we create empowering learning environments that allow young people to envision and enact a sustainable future? And so to explore these topics, I first designed a study that I'll talk about that took place in Colorado. And this was a 15-week after-school program for 10 to 12-year-olds. That was a collaborative multi-site project in partnership with 3 Northern Colorado Boys and Girls Clubs that combined climate change education with youth-led participatory action through photo voice methodology. And I'll describe each of these components here in a moment. But I named the program Science Camera Action to refer to these different aspects of the program. So the program took place in 3 different cities with various sized groups, and participants were also pretty ethnically and racially diverse compared to the cities where this research took place. Program components were grounded in the hands and heart model for transformative sustainability learning. And I'll just talk about each of these components in turn. So the first component of the program was the educational activities. And this, it consisted of 6 one-hour-long hands-on educational activities that really spoke to the connections between the Earth's changing climate, local ecosystems, and sustainable actions within communities. Next was photo voice process, and this is a participatory action research methodology that's organized around digital photography. So every kid in the program was given a digital camera, and then following each program activity, they were asked to take photos related to how they were thinking and feeling about program topics. And then during monthly photo voice discussions, they would bring in their cameras, print their favorite photos, and discuss them in small groups. And so those photos then served as inspiration for the final part of the program, which was action. And this took place in a couple of domains. First, the kids developed family action projects that were designed to reduce their own impact on the environment through changes to their everyday behaviors, kind of in line with some of the more mainstream research in social psychology of climate change at the time. And then there was also a final 5 weeks of the program that were dedicated to kids developing collaborative action projects targeted at sustainable actions within the wider community. And so kids were coming up with their own ideas about what they wanted to do and then doing them. And so I want to talk briefly about each of the action projects before talking about program impacts. So again, their photographs served as inspiration for designing these action projects. And so the kids engaged in a consensus process where they were talking about what kinds of projects they would like to do locally. And then we picked some out. And in some cases, it was a combination of ideas. So in the smallest town, the smallest group that I worked with, participants were motivated to design and deliver a speech at a city council meeting and to press local officials in a town meeting for action on climate change. And so after presenting a brief synopsis of the problem, they also asked for and were granted permission to move forward with a tree planting campaign. And they planted a bunch of trees, but including some bigger ones in a newly opened public park. Another group that I worked with elected to raise awareness about climate change within and beyond their local community by designing a climate change education and action focused website. In addition, and this is typical of photo voice methodology, they held a photo gallery event to display the photographs that they took related to the problems in order to communicate with family and community members about climate change. And this sort of doubled as an event to unveil the website. And then the largest group that I worked with, they chose to restore a disused garden and outdoor learning space on the property of their Boys and Girls Club unit. So they weeded the overgrown lot and turned the soil and spread compost and planted more than 100 fruit and vegetable plants that they were harvesting by the end of the summer. So I'm not going to talk too much about program impacts, but there's a few things that I would like to highlight, especially regarding the ways that children talked about their sense of agency to be getting involved in environmental action as part of this program. So a major theme from some focus groups that I did following the program was that kids felt so much more capable and influential when it came to helping the environment. So for example, Scarlett, age 12, these are all pseudonyms, by the way. She said, before the program, I didn't know I could really help it. I thought climate change was something that was there that would keep growing and hurting the environment, but now I know that I can help out. Before the program, I felt insignificant, but now I feel empowered. And I know that even by sharing the information that I've learned from this program, I can help others. And kids were also talking about feeling quite a bit more capable of doing things that were above and beyond the environment. So for example, 12-year-old Bill said, to save the world, you don't need a superpower. You don't need anything like that. All you need is yourself and others to support you. And 12-year-old Gabe said, when I want to do something that's really hard for me to do, this program made me feel like I can be more confident in myself and have a better chance at actually being able to succeed. But a really important theme for me in analyses following this program was that kids' views of the capability of children and youth were sort of transformed through the process of the program. It was clear that young people had sort of internalized these messages from the dominant culture about what kids are actually capable of, and that those internalized messages were starting to get challenged by their experiences. So 10-year-old Peyton said, so how the program changed my mind is because I thought, well, I'm just a kid, I can't do that much. But I actually found out that we can do a lot. So I've been publishing on this research since it finished up in 2017. And this is a figure from a 2019 article that I published in the journal Action Research that was trying to make sense of what was really important about this program and what the kids were saying. And something that I want to point out without going into each part of this is the idea of children's enjoyment leading to their full cycle engagement. So this is kind of like the outer bold part of this image. And that is that every week, children were choosing to voluntarily be in that room with me. It wasn't, there was no compulsory participation. They could walk out and play basketball or soccer or whatever they wanted to do every week, but they came back. And it was because, thankfully, they were having fun and they were enjoying what they were doing, and they were enjoying learning and taking action and all of these things that the program had. So I have been talking about this ever since, that to do this kind of work, we have to make sure that kids are laughing and having fun and have some kind of control over the process, and that it's a joyful sort of activity. Okay, now I want to get into a bit of the work that has grown out of the Science Camera Action original program in Colorado. And this is another partnership that centers on arts-based, youth-led action, but this time it's in Jacmel, Haiti. And so the partner organization for this is Jacmel Expression. So they are a community-based arts organization that has a mission and ethic around radical inclusivity and non-discrimination. They have programming that centers on art and technical skills training. And the whole point of the organization is to be investing in the capacities of local community members to support well-being. So you might notice that some of this imagery kind of mirrors some of the stuff from Science Camera Action, and that's because this project started about, I would say, the year that I was wrapping up the previous project. And so it is also based on the hands and heart model of transformative sustainability learning. But instead of focusing on climate change more broadly, it's focused on water issues in Jacmel, Haiti. And I'll talk a little bit about the context here. So Jacmel is on the southern coast of Haiti. It exists at a place with plentiful fresh water. It's sort of the confluence of 3 freshwater rivers that are flowing down towards the southern coast. They have plenty of rainfall. In fact, you would say that access to clean and fresh water shouldn't be an issue, except for infrastructure challenges and local pollution, which we will see. But Jacmel is also considered to be the arts and cultural capital of Haiti. So they're known for their annual Carnival celebrations and local art, especially paper mache. And so the educational program content that took place in Jacmel, Haiti was around integrating science topics like around water systems and quality and management with the arts through digital photography. And it was emphasizing the transformative potential of creative expression to generate positive social change. So the educational activity is focused on using digital cameras to capture and communicate ideas and issues. and then was also exploring the critical importance and local problems related to water. So they would, throughout the program, the kids would do day trips to regional water sources like rivers and streams and lakes, and they would photograph water sources and problems and collect water samples to do actual testing. And then at the end of each cycle, the children held community events to feature their photography. They were screening short documentary films that they were making during the program to communicate about these issues and also share the results of water testing. So the events were really kind of targeted at sparking dialogue about community issues and how to address them. So we've been through multiple iterations of this. It's a true sort of participatory action research partnership where we're going through multiple cycles and kind of reflecting on how things are going and really growing into this project over time. But it's in its third cycle right now, and the students are currently making maps. So they're displaying the actual water sample and results from their water tests in all of these different places. And some of them are depicted here on this map, but there's quite a few more by now. So the process is ongoing, and the hope is to actually create, a community resource around, these different water sources and quality and what needs to be done. So just quickly, some data from this project. One impact of the program is, like in Science Camera Action, kids are starting to, rethink their own capabilities. So this quote is from the founder director of the organization. And she says, young children learn that they can use their creative voice or use their voice through creative methods to elevate that in their community and actually take part in dialogue, where before they were just some kid who was there just to learn. And of course, this is sort of juxtaposing some of the more traditional top-down approaches to education with what can happen in these participatory processes. And another theme focused on sort of countering the deficits focused views of Haiti, which often come from outsider driven research agendas. So another quote was that the kids and students are motivated to show the strength of Haiti as well as the problems so that they can educate, being able to give these students cameras saying, choose your own image. And they really choose these beautiful images of Haiti that include the problems. So I'm going to kind of skip over a little bit here so that I can make sure to stay within the time. But in youth narratives, there's sort of this sense of collective agency that we're seeing, that they can identify and plan and implement solutions and advocate for change alongside other youth. So the final quote that I'll share with you is that and one of the students said, I can unite with other youths like me, talk to them. We could write to the town hall office and let them know what we dislike in the country, such as the ton of trash that's everywhere. There are too many people suffering. We would love that to change. Or we could get together to collect the trash and encourage people to stop throwing their trash in the streets. And to me, what this quote is talking about is advocating for change and for changes to be happening at the level of government and programs, but also the idea of making change sort of collectively and collaboratively with other young people. So this is the final and briefest part of the presentation. I just want to kind of transition to this idea of climate just futures before wrapping up and talk a little bit about where my research is headed. So my youth-focused research kind of exists within these broader questions as well, like what do the cultural and social systems of a more just and sustainable world look like, and how do educators and scientists work in solidarity with young people and with communities as they seek to build sustainable systems that reflect their own values. And so this is a figure from another recent publication that was talking about how we can be integrating the arts and sciences in these different ways, some of which might be more science-centric, others more arts-centric. And I think that spectrum is really demonstrated a lot by the Colorado and the Haiti case studies. And this is a methodological framework that appeared in my recent co-authored article in Sustainability Science, which basically just talks about how, look, a lot of this stuff has been very top down. You know, in educational spaces, we're talking about you know, what children need to know, and science, a lot of times telling people, you know, what needs to get done. But what I'm trying to say is that it's where the top down and bottom up come together, is where these really meaningful collaborative community projects for sustainability can take place. And so a key finding, you know, that unites both of these projects really, is that kids were reporting positive outcomes at multiple levels. So as a psychologist, you know, kind of looking at some of these individual level impacts, there was evidence that the kids were showing greater confidence in themselves, greater understanding and knowledge, feeling really influential. And this was happening simultaneously alongside community level benefits where kids were contributing to tangible change in community settings. And before ending, I just want to zoom way out and talk a bit about how the world has been sort of shifting around around this research and what I see happening next. So first, when I began this research, there wasn't a lot of understanding around doing research with kids and climate change. It was sort of like, what why would we be doing that? And so I felt like a lot of the times I was sort of explaining the point of this work as part of it. And there was very little research about kids and climate change and almost nothing outside the formal classroom. But a lot of that's changed in the last 5 or 6 years. So the body of literature here has exploded in that time, so as has, you know, public support for the necessary changes. So I took writing this presentation as an opportunity to kind of think about my own research in this broader context and sort of superimposed some of these projects alongside some of the bigger kind of happenings in the youth climate justice movement. So when Science Camera Action was starting, that was when countries had all signed on to the Paris Climate Accords. The children were suing the government as part of the Juliana versus United States court case. And then, you know, this was years before, you know, learning of Greta Thunberg's school strikes and the subsequent rise of what is now a very visible and very powerful youth climate justice movement. So I think a lot of this stuff makes a lot of sense, and it sort of has been mirroring some of these things for a while. And I'm so excited about what I'm seeing with the youth climate justice movement. So I'm diving into that in future studies. I want to understand, so I'm launching a interview study of youth climate justice activists now. I want to understand where they're coming from. I'm also right now working on a couple of systematic reviews looking at how climate justice is represented in education, and also, you know, what the landscape of research looks like around acting and activism for climate justice. So my final thoughts. I just want to return to this image from earlier in the presentation. It really just kind of shows my research on the right compared to some of the more traditional work in psychology on the left. And I think it's important to point out that these two research areas aren't in competition or conflict with one another, but rather they're complementary to one another, and both are needed, right, to bring about societal transformation towards climate just futures. And so as this momentum continues to build, I think there's going to be a lot of people that are looking to scholars from across disciplines, from the sciences to the arts to the humanities, about how to pave paths towards more sustainable and climate just futures. And I'll end with an important take home. And that is that the research that I've presented to you today, it doesn't just view addressing climate change as a matter of achieving ecological stability in order to uphold the status quo, or continuing, you know, living in a way that feels quote unquote normal to us now. But rather the problems that we collectively face are an opportunity for large scale societal transformation and cultural transformation towards both flourishing ecosystems and thriving human communities. And it's up to all of us, including and especially young people, to imagine and create those futures starting now. And I welcome your comments and your questions about the path forward.
Thank you so much, Carlie. That was wonderful. We'll open the floor to questions. Please feel free to put them in your chat or in the shared chat here. Or if anybody would like to raise their hand, we might be able to also handle questions that way right now. Let's see. Lori, did you want to start us off?
I would love to, and as the people get their questions together again, we'd love to have you drop them in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand and come off mute. Carlie, thank you so much. That was an absolutely beautiful, thought-provoking, inspiring presentation. And a couple of times in the presentation, you referred to that seminal 2015 report about the state of climate education in our nation, which, as you noted, is very concerning, not only that we don't have a common curriculum around climate education, but also, as that report showed, that a lot of teachers are sometimes bringing in misinformation and myths and so forth. So I wonder if you were named the next department head of the Department of Education, and you could create a climate change education curriculum for K through 12, high school, you pick the age, what is sort of the core component that you would want to see, knowing that you might only get a week to do this in a given K through 12 classroom in the US? So what would you bring forth for that common curriculum should we ever have it? Thank you, Carlie.
Absolutely. So I want to answer that question in two ways. First, I don't think that if I had this really powerful position, I think that we should be teaching about these topics throughout the curriculum, right? So not just in the science classroom, across the different kind of school subjects, because there's so much going on with climate change and sustainability challenges more broadly that could be addressed in every single school subject that there is. And so I think, there's a way of talking about these challenges from so many different perspectives, and in an age appropriate way across the grade levels, right? But if I had to talk about it in terms of sort of like a week long or a couple weeks long unit or something like that, I think more and more what the research is telling us, and certainly some of the research that I've done, is that it should be people focused in addition to environment focused, right? Like we can talk about the ways that these sustainability challenges are caused by and experienced by and can be addressed by people around the world. And also we should be integrating an action component, right? So that young people can start to develop that sense of agency, that it's within their power to be doing some things about these issues, and in all different kinds of ways, from day-to-day sort of, lifestyle habits and things that do give a sense of agency when they're changing those things, all the way up to, broader, higher level, community collaborative action projects. I could go on. Other questions?
I have a question I can ask.
Sure.
Forgive me if you answered this already, but I'm curious about how we can offer kids like the kind of psychological support that they would need, because along with becoming an agency of change, there's like a sense of responsibility. And with responsibility, there could be like a sense of failure. And I also ask because like I grew up in the 90s when like Captain Planet was everything. My teachers were talking about the ozone layer and CFCs. And like, I remember being that age and being like really wrapped up in it emotionally and like crying at my desk when we had to watch videos about the environment. So I just wonder like what kind of support, like how could that be dealt with, that kids would be supported emotionally in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. That's an excellent question. And honestly, if I see the research literature sort of exploding in an area, that's where I see it. So it has to do with anxiety and grief and kind of dealing with this, the emotional kind of dimension of climate change. And here's what I would say as far as younger kids is that what we are seeing, and there's plenty of evidence out there in the published studies that exist, is that um, younger kids are feeling a sense of depression, alienation, and in some cases outrage about climate, in part because they haven't been learning about this, from any like formal mechanism, right, in their schooling. And then they're seeing what a huge deal it is. And then add to that the idea that not enough is being done. And so all of this is actually creating the current emotional atmosphere around the issue. And so I would venture to say that talking about this stuff sooner, honestly, in the classroom and in other venues, and starting to kind of work on them and pay attention to the different things that can be done to address the issue would already be healing in a way, because right now it just feels like it's sort of not being discussed. And then when you consider that different age groups are going to be dealing with this in different ways, then we would have to talk about, well, what is it, for the youngest kids, and then what is it for some of the older kids? And I wasn't sure about that when I was designing my own stuff. So in the Colorado program, I really went the science route. So even though I was sort of critiquing that in the beginning of the presentation, you could see that that was still a framing that I was using in 2015, 2016 as the way that the program looked. And in some ways I felt like maybe if we focus on plants and animals and then we talk about how people can do stuff about it, then it won't be super tragic and alarming and overwhelming, to hear about. And actually what I experienced in the program was that these 10 to 12 year olds, and who were 11 to 13 year olds sometimes by the time they were getting out of the program, was that they were making the connections with the people aspect. So they were like, oh, look at all these glaciers and how they look different over the time, and this means sea level rise, and sea level rise means homes are being lost and people are losing their homes, and just kind of making those leaps to some of the social aspects. So the literature out there right now is talking about the fact that, wow, actually, some of these justice concerns are more compelling to some people, educators and students, compared to the biospheric concerns. And so actually talking about these things can be really motivating and can help to bring people into the conversation. So, and I didn't even say this, but probably the most important thing is that taking action in small to big ways can be such an important force for ameliorating these anxious and depressing kind of feelings that we have about the issue. So I think what's harmful in a way is kind of learning about the gravity of these issues and then just being told, okay, now you know, and just go live your life now. But to learn about how to do things about it and to be actually invited to collaborate in projects and things like that can be healing as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that's kind of what happened to me when I was a kid. you know,
Yeah.
they gave this information and then that was it. So you were just kind of stuck with that. Yeah, you're right. Like the framing of the narrative would really help ameliorate that. And I think also, we're at a point in time where we're talking about mental health more than ever. So that will help with that too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And I feel like so many people are asking that right now and talking about, how to deal with the mental health aspects for young people and for adults. I mean, we're all going through this and sort of experiencing it in different ways. And we need to, consider that. I think about it for climate scientists too, who are looking at this stuff every day. It seems like a really emotionally especially draining thing to be dealing with it as a career, and really being able to kind of feel the depth of the changes that need to be made and not watch, seeing them not be enacted yet has got to be especially troubling. I've thought about doing that study, by the way, of, of climate scientists and how they're dealing with these things and what they would recommend for other people. And maybe they have some secrets, you know, for all of us about how to deal emotionally with some of it.
Yeah, there's some wonderful photo projects of looking at climate scientists and thinking about how they're coping. And it seems to me that your work, Carlie, actually speaks to that in a way that I didn't really hear in the talk, but that is that all of these projects that are coming out of the student work actually really benefit society as a whole, in that we are almost as adults voyeuristically feeding off some of that enthusiasm and sense of purpose and excitement and feeling like the sky is kind of limitless that gets lost, I think, pretty quickly, and the cynicism sets in and we start to feel like the enormity of the world's problems are insurmountable. So there's something really lovely about tapping into the energy of kids that feeds both ways. So even though sometimes when I'm looking at some of these science education projects with a little bit of doubt, I have to confess, and part of that is because I do think that, you know, some of these larger systemic issues that really are not conquerable by an individual, and I have these, you know, senses of, well, we don't want to disillusion kids to make them, you know, not recognize the larger consequences, and again, the systemic problems. But if we can do that in a way that's honest, which you certainly are doing, you know, giving them enough information, maybe not telling them all of the different channels that would have to be, you know, gone through to actually make something happen. And again, it's grade level specific, but that again, that there can be this interchange between the adults that are getting really cynical about things, the kids that have new ideas and are coming to it fresh, and a really kind of lovely flow. So anyway, that's what came to mind for me for the first time in this, is thinking about, wow, we can really benefit from that, that naivete and excitement.
Absolutely. I agree. Actually, in building the program initially, I wanted to be inviting, you know, scientists into the space and to be kind of facilitating some of these activities and thinking about doing some of the educational stuff. And Lori, I don't know if you remember this, but actually part of my advising at the time was thinking about this as a program that could be done by other people in other places. And what if, you know, and so to keep it maybe contained into the room, right? Can people, you know, not climate scientists like me, you know, facilitate the activities and think about it being something that could happen in other places. But to this day, I wonder if we had some outsiders, some climate scientists and other, you know, relevant scientists and graduate students facilitating the activities, there's the possibility that doing that kind of work in collaboration with children could also be something that is supportive of, you know, that mental health and kind of coping that's happening by people who are in that space all the time. There's some real power in connecting with young people and seeing their exuberance and their excitement and motivation to work on these issues. Because I didn't get as deep into the findings from my research as I would have liked to, but certainly the ways that these topics were dealt with by the kids, they found learning about this stuff really motivating. Like they saw that this was a huge problem and they wanted to do something about it. And then when they were able to do their action projects, you know, this was experienced as really empowering. You know, they felt like, you know, we can work on these issues, and it was all really positive stuff. But I also agree that there's a line in there where when we think about young people getting excited about this stuff, there's also the possibility of sort of shirking responsibility and having that approach where it's about, you know, the young people will take it on and it'll be their responsibility and they can solve it. So we have to stop short of that and think about how do we work together and do these meaningful things together, and understanding the limitations of what these collaborative projects can be in terms of the sphere of how they're transformative for people, knowing that not every project will be, world changing, although they might change kids' minds or lives. Oh, you're muted, Erin.
Thank you so much. Well, I think if I don't see any other questions, thank you so much for joining us today, Carlie. This was such a pleasure. And we'll have this recording up for us, so please share this with folks. And yeah, thank you again, Carlie. We'll reconvene with the graduate students in a little while, but we're so grateful to have this today.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for being here. It's been a pleasure.